Hi, and welcome to our Chapter 1 lecture. So Chapter 1 really covers kind of a broad overview of what public speaking is. In the online book, you can see a chapter outline and kind of the major things you'll need to know. I'm not going to cover everything in this chapter, but some major points. So first, let's talk about why we even have public speaking in our college requirements. Most people think, wow, I don't really need public speaking. I'm already a good communicator. I talk all the time. Or I'll never need public speaking. I don't plan on being a politician. I don't plan on, being in front of a lot of people. But really, public speaking is so much more than that. So one of the first reasons that we teach public speaking is for college or for workforce readiness. So one of the number one skills we always see in things like Forbes and Business Insider and other kinds of demands from CEOs is that they want people to have good communication skills and good interpersonal skills. And communication skills, as you'll learn from this entire class, is more than just the ability to talk. It's the ability to listen critically, to take in information from a variety of sources, the ability to work in groups and work with others, and to be pliable and adaptive and kind of an ever-growing, changing workforce. I'm not here to tell you that communication skills is more important than other types of hard skills, but what research continually shows us is that workers need to have competent communication skills. And so in a fickle workforce where we're always changing based on technology or automation, the ability to communicate effectively could be the edge to get you a job. I know people are always concerned with being replaced by automation technology, but something that a computer will never be able to do is replace your ability to interface directly and communicate appropriately. In fact, AI researchers always have this really difficult time with creating algorithms for how AI can respond to human communication, because as we're going to find out, communication is uniquely human, and it's our ability to transfer symbols into structures that creates our ability to communicate. But more on that later. The next one is that it makes you a better student. So public speaking comes with a variety of talents, one of them being the ability to research, organize, and clearly adapt to your audience. This is important in any kind of class, whether you're in a humanities or a hard sciences. This allows for you to be able to work in groups, to work effectively with your professor, especially if you're having conflict over maybe something like a grade or content in the class. Sometimes the ability to work with others helps you negotiate things. The other thing that it does is it gives you just confidence, the ability to work up the nerve, to work up the confidence to go and speak in front of other people, helps you with things like networking events, helps you meet new people that might help you get a job somewhere or help you get a promotion. So public speaking has a little bit better, it gives you kinds of talents that are more than just being able to stand up and give a speech. The next one is a better citizen. So something that we'll learn throughout this course is that public speaking helps you become a better listener. And so even if you never want to run for office or do anything like that, we're always listening to politicians somewhere. They're on a headline, they're on the radio, they're running for office, they're influencing, not infecting, that's not nice, influencing different aspects of our lives. And there's always so much information about them, like what's real, what's fake news, that kind of concept. Critical listening and critical thinking skills that come as a byproduct of learning competent communication helps you understand things like framing or biases or credibility, and can help you think about public dilemmas, public policy making, and where a politician might be coming from, and helps us understand better some of the things that are going on in the world around us. The last one is I think it helps you become a better friend, a better partner, a better family member, and a better lover. So many arguments and so many discussions often come down to people just fundamentally not understanding what the other person is saying. Like, we understand the words. It's not that they're speaking a language that we don't understand, but rather we miss the intent, or we get so wrapped up in the content that we ignore the emotional component that comes with disagreements. I found that the more we work with public speaking and the more that we work on our communication skills, the more adept we are to listening, both audibly but also with our brains, and understanding people at a deeper level. So in all aspects, Public speaking can help you get a better job, a promotion. It can help you be a better student. It can help you be a better citizen. And it can help you be a better family member. Okay? This is one I often hear. So isn't public speaking just normal conversation? And that's not fundamentally true. Public speaking, at least in our context, is more of presentational speaking. But let's talk about the 3 kinds of ways we can talk about communication. So the first one is dyadic communication. As you can see here, the root word of dyadic communication is the word die. Die comes from the Greek word to, as opposed to the Latin word bi, which is where we get the word like bivalve or binary. Dyadic means two. So in dyadic communications, this is what we think of as one-to-one communication, the ability to just have 2 people communicating together. We experience dyadic communication all the times when we're talking to our friends, when we're talking to our family, our coworkers, all kinds of stuff. So the way that we communicate from one-to-one or interpersonally is a lot different than the way we communicate in, say, a small group or a class. That leads us to the next kind of communication, small group communication. Small group communication is usually in a group of about 3 to 10 people. And in that kind of communication setting, you don't always get to talk to everybody, or the people who you do talk to don't maybe have the same depth of relationship as you do with some other people's. And when we get into the group communication chapter, we'll see some of the components that emerge as part of that. And the last one is mass communication. So mass communication is like what the president does when they get up and they give an address to the nation, or like news anchors when they're kind of talking to a really large audience. And the way that mass communication works, there's generally not consistent feedback. It could even be argued that what I'm doing right now is a form of mass communication, because at any given time, somewhere between 30 to 120 students are viewing this material, and I have no idea what you're thinking of it. I can't see if you're nodding. I can't see if you're shaking your head no. I can't see if you're asleep. Like, I have no idea how you're receiving the material, and that changes the way that I present the material versus if I was in a classroom and we were all speaking face to face, and I brought up a concept like dyadic communication and saw a lot of confused faces. I would go into a little bit more detail and provide a few more examples until I felt comfortable that the class had gotten all the information available. But in this situation, I'm not able to do that. I cannot adapt to any kind of questions or concerns. In the moment, I would have to answer an email question or a discussion board question. The feedback is not synchronous. That's the same with mass communication. The president doesn't know if he's done a good job with his speech until, a couple minutes or a couple hours later when people write about it or people comment on it or so on. And I mean, yeah, it's a very interconnected, growing world, so that feedback is a little bit more immediate than maybe in the past, but the concept remains the same. Mass communication drastically changes the way that we communicate because it's not synchronous, the feedback is not immediate, and the audience is so much wider that the content of what you're talking about has to be flexible enough for a wide group of people. Okay, so let's talk about the models of communication. There's actually more than just these 2, but for the purposes of an introduction class, I think these are the most useful ones to talk about. So the first one is the linear view, which depicts communication as something a sender does to a receiver. This theoretical model was proposed in 1949 by Shannon and Weaver for Bell Laboratories, aka the phone people. So in this model of communication, it's very simple. You have the sender, the message, and the receiver. And it works, step 1, the sender creates a message, sends it to the receiver, just like that. And then the receiver becomes the sender, takes the message, and sends it back, right? That's probably fine. It's a very one-way process, but if you really think about it, that's not how we communicate. Not truly. In the kind of abstract concept, yes, we are sending a message one at a time, but lots of people had a problem with that because they didn't think about how we read other parts of the communication process, like nonverbals or eye contact or sighing. Those are all kinds of responses that influence communication. So in 2008, 60 years later. In 2008, Bartland's model of transactional communication kind of hit the field, and that really resonated with people much more. So in the transactional view, the idea is that people send and receive messages simultaneously. And I think this is much more illuminating for how communication actually happens between people. So think about when you're having a conversation with a friend. You're telling them all about your day, you're telling them all about their conflict, and the friend is like nodding their head, or they're like texting away. Any of that you read in a certain way. So if your friend is nodding their head or shaking their head or like rolling their eyes, you read that as a way that influences how you're speaking or what they think of your content. If they're just texting away, you probably don't think they really care about what you're saying. Or if you're on a date and you're trying to tell somebody about yourself and the person is just like on their phone or like not making eye contact, all of that, even though they're not verbally speaking, they're giving you information that is influencing the communication process. And so instead of it being one way, flip, go back the other way, think of the transactional communication as happening all the time, okay? So let's talk about the elements of the communication process. So the first one begins with the source or the communicator. There is a person that has something that they want to share. At that point, when we have that person, we begin the encoding process. The encoding process refers to the process of taking an idea or an image and associating that idea with words and then speaking those words in order to convey a message. So, if I wanted to say, this water is really cool, or like, if I wanted to say this water is really cold, I have looked at the item, I have a mental idea of what I want to say. My brain has done the cognitive work of taking this item and putting it into verbal words, to which I then say, okay? It is very cold. The next process would be the receiver or the other communicator, okay? The person who I'm talking to. They will do a process called decoding, which is the opposite of encoding. They've taken words that they've heard and they've broken them down into the mental images or ideas that you want them to know, right? This allows for them to understand what you're saying. The encoding and decoding process is so natural to us when we begin at this point in our lives. But think about the times that you've heard a new word. Like, I'm eventually going to launch a whole new set of words at you, like ontology, axiology, praxeology, like all of these words, and I'm going to tell you what they are. But if in the moment that I just said them and you heard them and you didn't know what they meant, that meant that the decoding process stopped. You only were able to take in the sound and the word that I was saying and maybe understand the letters. Like maybe you think axiology is spelled A-X-E-O, right? Something like that. But if you don't really know what those are, the decoding process ends. And if you were in class, you would raise your hand and I would explain, and then the decoding process would begin again. We also see this with children, right? We tell children all the time that this is an item, so the child can recognize that object A has a symbol system of letters that create words that mean something, okay? Now, while the source and the receiver are encoding and decoding messages, there's other things happening at the time. So obviously, message is a critical component, but a message doesn't just have to be verbal communication. It could be nonverbal. It could be behaviors. It could be any of those concepts that are interpreted by the other person. So the message, we often always just think of like vocals, but think about tone. So if I say something like, I'm really happy to see you, you've taken in smile, eyebrow raise, tone, inflection, and the actual symbol words that I've used to say the content. But if I said, I'm real happy to see you. Again, same words, but eyes, mouth, inflection gives you a different kind of message. Or if I was like, I'm really happy to see you, You would take in all kinds of information, that I was sad or that I was troubled, right? So the message is more than just the vocal sounds that we're making or just the content of what we're saying. It's also the intent, it's the inflection, it's the tone, things like that. Now, the next component is the channel. And the channel very just simply means the way in which the message gets between the source and the receiver, or the two communicators, okay? So simply, if I am doing this, the channel is my phone, or like an actual like phone, or the television, or the radio, or in the case of just talking to each other, the channel is our mouth and our ears, right? The channel very simply is how the information gets across. Now, why does the channel matter to the communication process? One of the super easy examples to point to, and I think your textbook talks about it, is one of the very first televised presidential debates between JFK and Richard Nixon. So on the radio, people were just like, love Nixon. They thought what he had to say was really important. They thought it was great. And then when they did the public debate on TV, Nixon didn't wear any makeup or anything. And so the lights from the TV studio made him sweat. It made him kind of blotchy. He was pale. His suit faded into the background. And he just looked like a mess. And John Kennedy was like, yeah, put on the makeup. I'm going to wear a blue suit. It's going to be great. And he really stood out in the debate. So even though the content was the same, right? Nixon didn't change his policies for the televised debate, and neither did JFK. But because the channel was different, so was the reception of the message. And that's why channel can really matter. It's also one of the good reasons why if you're having a fight, it's generally better to not text the fight. It's better to either pick up the phone or meet in person, just because you lose so much when you're only doing it via text. The channel can influence the content of the message. The next thing is going to be noise. Noise refers to any kind of message or anything that interferes with message transmission or reception, okay? So there's different kinds of noise. So obviously the very first kind of noise is like actual sound. One of the biggest problems you might run into in this class is trying to find a quiet place to record. I've gotten so many speeches that I couldn't hear because someone had a TV on in the background and there was like children screaming and playing and being loud, or there was a lot of background noise from like a really loud air conditioner. So the first one is physiological noise. And the other one is psychological noise. So psychological noise is like the mental state or your emotional capacity at the time that you're receiving a message. Here's a really easy example. Think of every time that you've had to go to class after you've been fighting with somebody, like a friend or a partner. When you're in that class, are you really listening to the material, or are you thinking about like, man, as soon as I get out of this class, I'm going to tell them A, B, C, D, right? If that's happened to you, you've experienced psychological noise, something that influences the way the message gets through the channel and influences the way that you decode the message. Another one is like, if you are trying to think about, if you're listening to someone talk, but you're like, oh man, I have so many errands to run today, I have so many like chores I got to get done. Any of that is psychological noise, the things that keep you from listening to that. So the next part is worldview, and we're going to put a pin in it because we're going to talk about worldview more extensively in the next slide. And the last one is context or norm. So context is the time and place in which this speech act actually occurs, or the interaction. The way that you talk in church versus the way that you talk at a funeral versus the way that you talk at a party, a restaurant, a grocery store, all of those types of things influences the way that you talk. And they are dependent on things like cultural norms, okay? These cultural norms are unwritten, but we generally grow up learning how they are. Like this one time I was at a grocery store and a woman was talking very loudly on her phone and disclosed to pretty much everyone in line that she had contracted an STD, and she was really mad about it. That was probably the inappropriate time and context for which to transfer that information. It was very distracting. And then everybody knew that she had contracted an STD. The grocery store is not typically the place we have those conversations. Perhaps we have those conversations in our homes or at a friend's house, maybe even a bar, but typically not in the grocery store. Conversely, you typically don't go to a wedding and talk to the bride extensively about her ex, or the groom about their ex, right? We typically don't do that. So the context often influences the way that we talk about any kind of stuff, and it influences the way we communicate stuff. So it just refers to the norms that govern our situations and our relationships. Let's talk about worldviews. Okay. A worldview is the framework for which we interact within the world. And there's kind of 5 ways we think about worldview. The first one is epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know, right? How do we acquire knowledge? In our society, we tend to be very data-driven, so we collect years and years of research for which we then say we know something. So like, for example, smoking causes cancer. There was not one study that came out and then everybody was like, oh, well, we know that smoking is a carcinogen. It took a study here, a study verifying that study, a study verifying the study, a study trying new variables, until eventually all these little studies came together as pebbles that built a mountain of data that suggested something is generally true, right? That smoking is a carcinogen and can lead to cancer, right? In that instance, the reason that we know that smoking causes cancer is because we have data that backs it. Now, personally speaking, you might have somebody who, as a result, epistemology is connected to public speaking because it governs how the audience thinks about information and what we think of credible. Like, what do we believe to be a valid source of information and what we think information is valid or not valid. The next one is ontology, which is how we see or how we know something is true or false. So you may or may not believe in a higher power. You may or may not believe that the Texans are the greatest football team of all time. You may or may not believe that Star Trek is better than Star Wars, right? Ontology is the way that we talk about what governs our beliefs. This is important because if you're giving a speech, understanding the beliefs of your audience can influence the way that the credibility of the speaker is done, right? I favor myself to be a social scientist. So if I go and listen to a presentation where somebody says, the earth is flat, I may not quite believe that they are credible enough to tell me anything else, right? Because they have challenged what I believe to be a scientific norm. Okay, we should never just assume that our audience shares the same beliefs. It's probably not cool to assume that each person has the same religious background or that each person has the same national background, right? We may all have different kinds of beliefs, and that ontological understanding of a belief system influences the way that speakers are perceived and the way that speeches are written. The next one is axiology, which is our value system, how we perceive what is wrong or right or good or unfair. Okay, so axiology, oftentimes our values don't represent things that we want, not things that are. So for example, if I disclose something personally, I am a pacifist. I don't believe in any kind of violence. So does that mean that violence isn't going to happen in my life, or that I'm not going to see violence, or might even be forced to perpetrate violence in self-defense or otherwise? No, that's unrealistic. But my value system is pacifism. I believe in a pacifistic society. So if I'm listening to a speech on how we should always exact violence on enemies, or how the best public policy is one that shows offensive military strength, I probably will not be a receptive audience because that value system I do not share, okay? It could also be something more cultural, something like modesty. People may not take kindly to a male speaker who dresses with like really fitted clothes or is shirtless or has lots of like Tattoos, that was like an always really popular one. Or for women whose skirts are a certain length or is too low cut, stuff like that. That can really offset an audience's understanding of good or bad because the speaker is violating some part of their value system. Now, I'm not here to say whether that's like wrong or right. I'm just saying that axiology will predict whether or not the speaker is revered as being credible or not credible. The next one is cosmology, which is not the same as cosmetology. Cosmology is our relational understanding to the universe and other people within the universe. It dictates our spiritual beliefs. So controversial speech topics like abortion or healthcare or death penalty are often related to the way that we see ourselves in relations to other and kind of our responsibilities to other people. The last one is praxeology, which is it denotes our preferred method of approaching everyday tasks to solve our problems. So for the implications in this class, somebody's preferred method of working on classwork will be to work several days in advance to have an outline of each task they're going to accomplish each day until they get to that project deadline, and they'll continually work on those tasks. Other people are deadline oriented and they're like, okay, the day that it's due, I'm going to just work all day and in through the night until it's done. I do not recommend that in terms of your speeches, but it is something that is very common, right? Praxeology just influences the way that we go about managing tasks or projects within our own lives. It influences your speaking because, especially if you're talking about something like policy making or changing something, the way that we go about that is going to influence the way that audiences receive the information. The reason why worldview becomes so important in our communication standards is like, yeah, we all speak English, like we all speak the same like functional language, and as you'll learn from chapter 10, that language is very fungible, right? It's very subjective in nature. So when creating and writing our speeches or communicating with anybody, honestly, taking into the worldview forces us to adapt in order to make our points well known. In controversial topics like something like immigration, if we don't take into account how somebody else feels about that topic, we will always just two ships passing in the night. We will never come to any kind of consensus because we're continually not taking into account the way that they perceive an issue like immigration or healthcare or abortion or marriage or entitlement spending or taxes. Kind of everything that we think of as a divisive policy point becomes heightened due to this inability to take in worldview and adapt to that. But even interpersonally, like how we manage money, one of the biggest predictors of divorce is financial issues because often couples don't have conversations for how we prioritize money. If we get a bonus, am I a person that believes that spending a bonus money should be something for fun because it's extra money in our income and we don't need to budget it, so we should treat ourselves? Or am I the kind of person that is more frugal and believes that we should take that money and put it into savings for emergencies? Not having those kinds of conversations about our worldview, how we see the world, what we think is good, what do we prioritize, how do we accomplish tasks, leads to conflict. And so it's important to take those into account. Because of its profound influence on our ability to encode and decode, we always want to be careful with what kinds of language choices we're using as well. So we have two types of language choices we can use. We can use concrete language or abstract language. Concrete language are words that can be perceived through the senses. So if I were to say dog, which I think is the example in the book and a really common one, and I tell you to think of a dog, we're going to think of all kinds of different dogs. Like I'm going to think of my dogs. So a Corgador who's all black, a Stray who's all brown, and a Pit Bull who's white and black, right? I'm going to think of those dogs. You might think of a Golden Retriever. You might think of a cartoon dog like Scooby-Doo or Snoopy. Or you might think of your own dogs. Or maybe you hate dogs and you're like, why is she asking me to think about dogs, right? Whatever you thought of, I was using a concrete word because we can touch a dog, we can hear a dog, we can smell a dog, right? It's a concrete word, But the subjectivity of language and the influence of worldview changes the way we think about what dog means. Abstract words are words that refer to concepts or ideas that are removed from material realities. So love, success, happiness, justice, kindness, honor, freedom, all of those kinds of words, right? We can't touch those items. We can't we can't feel those items, right? But we use them all the time, and people's worldview will influence the way you see them. Like an example that we use kind of all the time in policy making and political discourse is the word terrorist. And I think more than ever, people really debate about what that word means. In the 90s, a terrorist could have been an eco-terrorist, someone who never killed anybody, no one ever died, but set fire to State Department vans. So arson in terms of functionality, but labeled a terrorist because of their political ideology. In the early 2000s, we would have thought terrorists were always pegged as external agents seeking to inflict violence upon American people and soil based on political opposition. And now people use terrorists for all kinds of things. People call Black Lives Matter terrorists. People call white supremacists terrorists. People call cops terrorists. People call Islamic extremist terrorists. People call the Sandy Hook shooter a terrorist. And I'm not saying that one of those are wrong or right. I mean, we all have our personal views on what we think that means. And the reason we have those personal views is because our worldview influences the way those abstract words resonate, but yet we use them all the time, presuming that our audience or the person we're talking to shares that same meaning, when functionally all of these words are influenced by our worldview. And that's why it becomes so important to think about the other person's background and how they perceive something, so we can communicate effectively about really big dilemmas or just our own personal conflicts. Okay? So let's talk about communication principles. Communication can be both intentional and unintentional. We commit so many micro movements with our face, right? So many gestures that we're not aware of. There's been plenty of times I can remember being a young person and rolling my eyes and my parents saying, "Don't roll your eyes at me," to which I said, I didn't roll my eyes, because I was just so unaware that I was being that obnoxious, right? Or how many times have you been fighting with somebody and you say something and it gets taken and your response is, "I didn't mean it like that." It just happens. Communication can do both of those things. It's also impossible not to communicate. If you were asleep in my class right now, you would be communicating something very important to me, that you were disinterested. Even when we're dead, we are placed into our coffins and put on heavy makeup and forced to have our arms like this to give the impression that we're sleeping, right? We are trying to communicate that we are asleep. So even in that instance, we're always communicating. It's impossible not to, okay? Silence, huge communicator. If you're fighting and someone's giving you the silent treatment, oh, that's a big communicative flag, right? We all know it. Communication is also irreversible. It's most evident when you say something hurtful to someone you love, or if you've been on the receiving end of a hurtful message. And even when the person apologizes and tries to take it back, you never forget the hurt, and you never forget what they said. Because of that, it's always important to speak with intention. It's always important to check our emotions and where we're coming from when we choose to speak, because speaking and communicating can be a choice in that way. The other thing is that online communication, we well know, is not reversible. Doesn't matter how many times you try to delete that comment, someone has already screenshot it and will live on. So intentionality in communication is incredibly important. Communication is unrepeatable. Now, what do I mean by that? Surely you can say the same things over and over again. And you can. I've been teaching this class for several years and I say the same things over and over again. But each time they're different. Each time we say something, there's a different inflection or a different tone or a different gesture because of who we're talking to or why we're talking in the first place. Everything will always be a little bit different each time because of how the nature of communication works between people. Meanings are not in the words themselves, and we've kind of discussed that extensively with worldview, and we'll discuss it again in chapter 10, but we all know that meaning comes from the intention and meaning comes from the receiver. So I can say a word intending it to be one way, and the receiver can decode it and mean it in another. So it doesn't matter if I say the word L-O-V-E. If I say, I love you as a friend, and the person wanted to hear, I love you as a partner, it doesn't matter that the word love is the same. It doesn't matter that it's the same symbol system. The meaning changes. More communication isn't always better. We often hear that, oh, people just need to talk it out. We just need to talk it out. But that's not really the question, is it? It's not about solving a problem through talking more. It's about solving a problem through talking effectively. If you are having a fight with a partner, if you are having a fight with a friend, or if you're arguing somewhere, sometimes less is more. Taking into account how the person is feeling, taking a break to collect your thoughts, taking a moment to divorce the emotional response from the logical words that you want to use. Sometimes talking it out isn't the answer. Talking it well and doing it competently usually is. Communication cannot solve all problems, but it can solve most of them. Let's take the instance of marriage. Remember when I said that the biggest predictor of divorce is the way that we view finances and money? You cannot communicate someone into believing a different thing. If somebody believes that money should be spent on material goods instead of saving them, and that's because they grew up without having material goods, and now that they have them, they're going to give them to their kids and give them everything that they want, right? If that's their belief, and your belief is, no, the only way that we remain secure for our children and our family is to save money and to make sure that we always have a nest egg and to make sure that we're always supportive. Communication cannot make those differences change, but they can tell you where those differences matter and where they don't matter. And communication helps you solve whether or not that marriage is good for you or not. Now, successful communication doesn't always mean shared understanding. The thing is that you may never understand why your partner wants to spend all that money, or you may never understand why your partner wants to save all that money. But you do understand and respect that that's how they see it and how they believe it and how they want it to be. And you can move on from there. It's the same as people who are in committed relationships who have opposing political ideologies, right? One person may be conservative or one person may be liberal. And no matter how much they talk, they'll never come to an agreement. But they can have successful communication and understanding, respecting, and sharing the mutual respect for each other. Now, what makes an effective communicator? There is no perfect way to communicate all the time. Take myself, for example. I study communication and language and all this stuff all the time. It's my job. It's my life. And even I have gotten sucked into a Facebook war or gotten mad in an argument and said something horrible. It's not always perfect, but we can all strive to be competent communicators. Competence is situational, relational, and can be learned. Put these all up here at once. Oops. Okay. When we say it's situational, it means that we have the ability to read situations and adapt to them appropriately. When we say relational, we understand how our communication affects the people for which we're talking to. And we learn this as we go on, right? The more that I traveled internationally and the more people I met, the more situations I found myself in. And sometimes communicating was not verbal. Sometimes it was nonverbal. Sometimes the best way to communicate was to not say anything at all. Or sometimes, based on the relationship, the best way to create happiness and cohesion was to not say something, was to keep it to myself, was to understand when it was and was not appropriate to speak or talk about an issue. To do this, recognize that there are a wide range of behaviors you can choose from. Develop the ability to choose the most appropriate behavior. Become skilled at performing those behaviors. Embrace cognitive complexity. Recognize that the version of yourself can have many versions, and that the way that you communicate your ideas and beliefs and values change, and the way that you think about them change based on your relational dynamics. Empathy. Having empathy with people. I can very much remember having several political disagreements in my own family at holidays and other kinds of special events until eventually I got so frustrated and I didn't understand why this family member believed a certain thing. And then I remembered all of this, that it doesn't matter why they believe what they want to believe. I want to preserve a relationship with that family member. And so I have empathy when it comes to that person's perspective, for why they believe that way, for how they came to those conclusions. And even though they are diametrically opposed to how I see the world, I have compassion for their beliefs and for why they believe those things. And so I engage in my cognitive complexity and think of ways to talk about the stuff that's important to me, right? I'm not going to be silenced. I'm not going to be shamed. But I think of ways to talk about what's important to me in an adaptive way that comes from a place of goodness and not from a place of, I'm going to win this argument. I'm going to make you feel like an idiot. I'm going to make you feel bad for thinking this way. I'm going to call you a variety of names until you comply with my worldview. But instead, I engage in this from a good place and think of a way to communicate that effectively. The next one is self-monitoring, right? Always be thinking about what you're saying and why you're saying it. If you feel yourself getting mad, perhaps that's a good monitoring check that the communication you're about to engage in is going to come from a non-ethical place. And the last one is commitment. It is exhausting to practice competency all the time. Sometimes you just want to be mad, or you want to be sad, or you want to be self-grandizing. We all want to. But there's a commitment to always being an effective communicator and a competent communicator, because it creates credibility for you amongst your friends, your peers, your colleagues, your partners. And above all else, people always want to be understood. They always want to feel like they've been heard, that they feel like they've been respected, and that they've been treated as an equal. Communication competency helps guarantee that in both the classroom, where we're at, and our own lives, where you go home to. So let's talk about the overview of what speeches are. Now, I'm going to go through these rather quickly because you have a whole lecture all about the intricacies of what each of these are. But functionally, the first thing you do is analyze the audience. Take into account everything we've just said about competency, about worldviews, about channels, about noise, about receivers, and understand that the success of a speech isn't determined by you. It's determined by the audience. So the first thing you do is ask yourself, who's going to be listening to me? The next thing you do is take that information and select a useful topic. You don't want to talk about something that's not useful to the people who are hearing it, right? It would be incredibly boring, and no one would listen or retain any information. So use that information to figure out what your topic's going to be. The next thing you do is determine why you're doing this, right? For this class, you probably think that the only reason you're giving a speech is because I'm making you. But I also let you pick your speech topics. I let you talk about whatever you want to talk about. So determine why you're talking about it. Is it because you're going to tell me about something that gives you joy? Is it something that makes you have purpose? Is it something that you're really passionate about? Is it something that will create awareness? Any of those are a reasonable purpose for what you want me as the audience to understand. The next thing you'll do is compose a thesis statement or a central purpose. This is going to be your anchor for your speech, right? The thing that you want them to know, the thing that you always draw back to, the central claim. Then it's going to be clearly organized. As you'll see from this class, your speeches have outlines. They have formulas for how you should give them, for how the information can remain coherent and cognizant. Then you're going to research, right? You want to have lots of good materials, lots of credible sources to support your argument, to support the thing that you're wanting to talk about, because as we've already discussed, The way that we build credibility isn't just on our merit alone, but rather the kinds of data that we present to prove something to be reasonably true. Then you're going to have a clear conclusion. It's always very difficult when you're listening to a speech that you don't know is over. Like, I've listened to plenty of vestment or maid of honor speeches where they don't end it with something like, so today we're here to honor the great union and love of these two people. Instead, they're like, haha, that was a crazy moment, to the couple. And you're like, oh, okay, it's time, right? A clear conclusion signals not only what the audience is supposed to retain, but also that the speech has come to an end. And then you want to think about your presentational aids. Some speeches require a visual aid, right, to demonstrate something complex or nuanced, and we talk extensively about presentational aids later. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes the speech is just as good without one. And the last one that's present in all speeches is clear and vivid language and controlled nonverbals. When I very first started public speaking, I could not give a speech without like swaying back and forth on my feet. I was always like transferring my weight, and my coach duct taped my feet to the floor so I wouldn't sway like a palm tree in a storm, right? That was a bad nonverbal. When I give true professional presentations like corporate trainings or have to give some sort of celebratory speech, I practice my hand gestures because my natural conversation style is like I'm hands everywhere. I'm always talking with my hands, and that's very distracting in an actual presentation. So in my speeches, I have written down like hand gesture up, hand gesture down, hand gestures to the side. There's plenty of speeches where I would say things like, today we're going to talk about the positives and the negatives, or the good and the bad, whatever. I've always planned them out. Or other kinds of nonverbals are like eye contact, smiling, and stuff like that. And you always want to use language that's very clear and invites the audience to continually listen. Again, in the next couple lectures, we're going to talk about each one of these steps by themselves. But for now, this gives you a clear overview of what a speech should look like. That's the end of chapter 1. Be sure that you read through the entirety of the chapter because there's content in the lecture that I gave that is not included in the book. And there's also more examples in the textbook, as well as a couple activities if you wanted to do them, and some review questions to help you understand the content. Thanks.